is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Does Harvard discriminate against Asian American applicants? That's the central question of a lawsuit that's been brought against the Ivy League giant. Adam Harris of The Atlantic has been covering the case and is here to share what he's learned. Adam, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about the plaintiffs here. Who are they and what do they want?
The plaintiffs are Students for Fair Admissions. It's basically this coalition of Asian American students that was brought together by Edward Blum, a conservative legal strategist who is also responsible for the Fisher versus University of Texas case, the Shelby County versus Holder case, several civil rights cases that have gone before the Supreme Court. And essentially, they're alleging that Harvard is discriminating against Asian American students in its application and admissions process.
What I thought was interesting about Mr. Blum is you mentioned how he was at the trial and, was just sitting there in one of the rows watching everything that's happened. But the other students who are involved in this case are not. Why not?
Essentially, his argument is that it is to protect the privacy of these students. The plaintiffs posit that you look at what happened to Abigail Fisher during the University of Texas case with her being so prominently featured and some of the blowback that was levied against her personally. Their argument is that they want to prevent those students from going through that same sort of thing. However, Harvard has kind of countered that without necessarily seeing these students testify and hearing their stories firsthand, it's hard to necessarily assess out what their motivations are.
What is the larger significance of this case just beyond this elite school? I mean, why should anyone who doesn't care about the Ivies care about this?
Well, the thought is that this will extend beyond the Ivies to the institutions that need to use race as a factor in their admissions process. So basically, this is seen as a larger threat to affirmative action. You look at who the lawyers are in this case, and they're all kind of Supreme Court tested lawyers who have either argued in front of the court or who have had some relationship with the high court. So this is sort of seen as laying the groundwork or as kind of the opening salvo into the next substantial challenge to affirmative action in the Supreme Court.
Affirmative action is hardly a new topic for the U.S. Supreme Court, but how does this case fit into some of the existing decisions, including those involving big public universities? I'm thinking of the universities of Michigan, Texas, California.
The difference here is the plaintiff. It is alleging discrimination against Asian American students, saying that if you have a racial preference, or maybe not a racial preference, but you're giving a tip to certain students, be them African American students, be those Latino students, if you're giving a tip to some students, does that also mean that you are docking other students in a negative way? However, as you mentioned, there's a long history of litigation at the Supreme Court. So you have the Bakke case in 1978, you have the Grutter and Gratz decisions, where the Supreme Court has kind of upheld the use of race in admissions as a way to diversify the campus.
In reading some of the coverage, you could get the impression that the parties in this case have tried to paint Harvard's use of affirmative action as favoring African Americans and Latino students and penalizing the scoring process if you were Asian American. Is that a fair summation of what's happening?
The plaintiffs are arguing that there is a significant Asian penalty when you're looking at the personal rating. So Harvard has several portions of their admissions process, and students are assigned ratings on extracurriculars, on athletic ability, on academics, and also on a personal rating, which is consistent of teacher evaluations, counselor evaluations, alumni interviews, things like that. But the plaintiffs allege that the way that Harvard is using race in admissions is they're using it as a tip in the personal rating, which in their estimation would dock Asian American students.
I want to give a shout out to one of your colleagues at The Atlantic, Aaliyah Wong. I thought she did a fantastic job on a takeout essay looking specifically at that personal ratings question and the difficulty there in adjudicating that. So I would encourage folks to go over to The Atlantic and take a read of that.
Yes, definitely. It's a subjective rating, but as she pointed out in a later essay, one of the issues with admissions, particularly elite admissions, is that all of it is kind of subjective. Institutions aren't going to look solely at academics as the only judge because they're trying to build this robust, diverse campus. So there are some issues with the admission structure of elite colleges that lend themselves to these sorts of challenges.
Their story touches on an aspect of this that I thought was important to highlight, and that is that there isn't necessarily a suggestion here of ill will or an intentional effort to block Asian American students. Rather, there's an argument that this is implicit bias and what I would call institutional or structural racism at the heart of this. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and it is. They're not alleging that Harvard is doing anything intentionally discriminatory. However, what they're saying is that every person has their implicit biases, and such that the systems or structures that they create may have the implicit biases built into them. So what they're arguing is that with this personal rating, implicit bias is built into the personal rating, and the implicit bias is against Asian American students.
We're talking with Adam Harris at The Atlantic about his coverage of a lawsuit brought against Harvard University alleging it discriminates against Asian American students. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Adam, how should journalists put this case in context in which colleges of all types have long give admission advantages to rich and powerful families? For example, we've seen recent scandals at the University of Texas and Illinois where college leaders actually pulled strings to grant admission to underqualified children of politicians, donors, and other influencers.
Where we have this challenge to affirmative action, a lot of people have mentioned that maybe we should also be discussing legacy admissions. And this is also one of the things that the plaintiffs at Students for Fair Admissions brought up during the case. They didn't focus on it as much during the closing arguments because they were focused more on the personal ratings. But this is something that for the American public, they're really concerned about legacy admissions and the way that, I guess, money and wealth and donors factor into the admissions process. But I think reporters should also remember that not all institutions are selective or subjective enough to need to use either legacy admissions or race in admissions for that matter. It's primarily the more elite institutions in a state, whether that's elite public institutions or elite private institutions.
But should the rules be different for a private university to consider something like legacy? I mean, isn't that the big draw for all these universities to get alumni to support them? If they end it, what would happen to their bottom line?
So essentially, their argument is that if they got rid of legacy admissions, then donors would stop donating, or they would feel less connected to the university, where they would no longer have that family connection to an institution, which could be problematic, though a lot of these institutions have large endowment bases to build on for years to come. However, I've talked to several Black alumni specifically who have also argued that now that we're in a position where our kids can benefit from legacy admissions is now the time that we're thinking about getting rid of legacy admissions, which I thought was something interesting and not something that I had thought about too much. But as the people who graduated in the 80s and the 90s, as their kids are turning 18, thinking about going to college, what does it mean for a time when more minority graduates of Harvard and Yale and Princeton than maybe ever before are sending their kids, and we're talking about getting rid of legacy?
Among competitive colleges, how unusual is Harvard's process, for example, giving applicants a quote-unquote personal rating?
A lot of competitive colleges, they argue that these are proprietary materials and they are not too keen on giving up what goes into their admissions process. But a lot of these selective institutions do have what they call a holistic admissions process, where you're looking at the whole student. So it's hard to say the amount of institutions that have a similar structure where they're also giving out personal ratings. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were more institutions that had a very similar model, because Harvard's model has been kind of held up over the span of 40 years since the Bakke decision as a kind of model for the way to diversify a campus that is selective.
Has Harvard's methodology paid off for them? Has the university improved its diversity through affirmative action?
It has improved diversity since, the 70s. and I mean, most institutions have. And I think the worry for Harvard is that if they were to get rid of race or the use of race in admissions, then the African-American and the Latino-American populations would fall precipitously. And there is some precedent for what it looks like when a state gets rid of affirmative action. Michigan, for example, they had the state proposition that got rid of the use of race in admissions and kind of the use of race in employment as well. The Black population has never recovered on campus. They saw a sharp decline, and they've never gotten back to their 1998, even 1999 levels of Black enrollment. So you do see kind of declines in diversity on campus when the use of race in admissions is done away with.
To be sure, Harvard has no shortage of star character witnesses to support their argument that diversity is a priority for them. One of them was Ruth Simmons, the first African-American to be president of an Ivy League university. She was president of Brown. What did her testimony bring to the table?
She does offer kind of a very forceful defense of diversity, and also any means to achieve that. Because having been at Brown and then now being at Prairie View A&M and kind of seeing all of the specters of higher education, she is in a unique position to argue the merits of diversity. However, perhaps one of the more compelling arguments for diversity was the student argument, where Harvard brought students in and they argued forcefully what diversity has meant to them being on campus.
The plaintiffs in the case, the Students for Fair Admissions and Harvard, both hired statisticians and economists to analyze the same admissions data. Why were the experts' conclusions so different?
So essentially, what you fed into the analysis produced some wildly different results. And whether you accounted for legacies or accounted for athletes or accounted for donors' children, or if you were accounting for the personal rating or the use of race in the personal rating, at the end of the day, all of this kind of rests on the coefficients and on all of this kind of nitty gritty. And we will see in a couple of months what shakes out as kind of the accurate analysis. There'll be facts and findings before the judge issues her final decision. But what you're feeding in is going to produce some wildly different results.
As you alluded, the judge in the case isn't expected to issue a ruling for several months. But I'm curious, in the meantime, has Harvard changed any of its policies in light of this lawsuit?
They have added to their reading procedures, which are basically a way to tell admissions officers how to use race in admissions. They've basically clarified how race can be used in the personal rating.
You make a pretty compelling case that what happens with this verdict is far from the last step, and this is really a test case on its way to the Supreme Court. What did you see as, when they threw that pot of spaghetti, what stuck to the wall here?
It seemed that what stuck was this idea that the personal rating is a proxy for race. And it seemed that the judge is at least willing to hear that argument. And it's also the argument that they focused the most on and they wanted to hone in on during their closing argument. So going forward, there will be a lot more conversation about the personal rating and whether or not it is a proxy for race. And if so, is that where Asian American students are penalized?
And obviously, with this case potentially headed to the Supreme Court, what's different up there is we have two new justices.
Yes, so Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Justice Neil Gorsuch have kind of shifted the landscape. What we're expecting is a court that is a little bit more skeptical and potentially a radically different future for how colleges can consider race in admissions.
Now you're something of an expert in affirmative action cases. What advice would you give to reporters who may be covering this issue in their own communities?
One of the stories that will be very important going forward is how colleges, particularly selective colleges, can diversify their campuses and how they are diversifying their campuses without using race in admission. So it will be important to look at the colleges in California. It'll be important to look at the colleges in Michigan, but also looking at your home schools and seeing what they're doing to increase diversity on campus.
So I'm going to piggyback on that, and I would say I would encourage people to not allow zip code and economic status to be a proxy for race.
Yes, because one of the arguments is that, maybe you can diversify by using socioeconomic status. And Sue Dynarski from the University of Michigan actually kind of pokes holes in that to say that one of the reasons why socioeconomic indicators don't serve as a perfect proxy is because there are simply more white people in the country. So there, by extension, will be more poor white people than there are poor Black people or poor Hispanics or poor Asian. So using that as a proxy may be a mistake as opposed to using them together.
Adam Harris covers higher education for The Atlantic and joined us from his office in Washington, D.C. Adam, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you, everybody. That wraps up another episode for us. And attention, qualified journalists. The EWA National Awards for Education Reporting is now open to submissions. The deadline is December 15th, so be sure to submit your best work for consideration. Find out more on ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.